Thomas Granger was born on a stormy March evening in 1937, in a modest terraced house on the outskirts of Belfast. His mother, Moira, always said the thunder had frightened him so badly that he emerged into the world screaming and never stopped making noise. She wasn't wrong. From the moment Thomas could walk, he tapped on pots, plucked at strings, and hummed melodies with uncanny precision. Music wasn't something he learned, it was something he remembered. By the age of 5, his fingers had found their way to a battered old violin left behind by an uncle killed in the war. It was too large for his small arms and missing 2 strings, but to Thomas, it was alive. The first time he drew the bow across the remaining strings, he felt something open inside his chest, a hollow space filled with sound. It wasn't beautiful, it squeaked and screeched, but it was his. His parents were poor but proud. His father, a dock worker with rough hands and a soft heart, believed that anyone given a gift must use it. "If your hands can make music, lad," he'd say, "then play till your fingers fall off." At 10, Thomas won a local youth competition. At 13, a benefactor from the city arranged for him to study with a retired symphony violinist. By 15, he was offered a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music in London. His parents wept when he left, his mother pressing a photo of them into his hand, whispering, "Play like you're coming home." London was overwhelming, crowded, cold, and brimming with ambition. Thomas was surrounded by students whose parents were patrons, professors, performers. He had nothing but his music and his battered violin. But that was enough. His professors called him gifted, raw, and explosive. He was drawn to passionate composers, Tchaikovsky, Paganini, Mendelssohn. The wilder the emotion, the closer it felt to his own heartbeat. Then came Vienna. It was 1958, and Thomas, only 21, had been selected for a summer performance at the Musikverein, the golden concert hall of dreams. He remembered the hall's chandeliers, glittering like constellations, and the scent of polished wood and roses drifting from the audience's perfume. As he stood center stage, violin beneath his chin, silence wrapped around him like silk. He played Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major, and for 29 minutes, he ceased to be Thomas Granger. He became the music. The ovation lasted 5 full minutes. He was offered more invitations than he could accept. But it wasn't just Vienna's music that changed his life. It was where he met Margaret. She had been working as a translator for visiting artists. A Dublin native with auburn hair, green eyes, and a voice as smooth as satin, Margaret had approached him after the concert to interpret a German conductor's compliments. Thomas remembered stumbling over his words, not because of the language barrier, but because of the way she smiled at him, like he was something she'd read about in books and had finally seen with her own eyes. They walked the cobblestone streets of the city for hours that night, talking about everything and nothing. She quoted Yeats and played Chopin on a cafe piano, with fingers more graceful than his own. He was smitten. She was skeptical. "I've seen musicians fall in love with music, not people," she teased. "I can love both," he said. It took him 3 months to convince her. He wrote her letters from every city, Paris, Salzburg, Rome, each one ending with a phrase he'd heard her say in Vienna. "There are no wrong notes, only unfinished ones." In 1961, they married in a small chapel in County Wicklow, overlooking the sea. He played for her as she walked down the aisle, a simple Irish melody he'd composed himself. Her veil caught the wind and fluttered like a flag of surrender. "I told you I could love both," he whispered as he kissed her hand. The years that followed were a blur of tours and sonatas. They moved into a modest townhouse in Dublin, filling it with records, framed concert posters, and love notes scrawled on the back of receipts. When they weren't traveling, Thomas gave lessons to young musicians, always reminding them, technique is the bones, emotion is the soul. They tried to have children, but Margaret miscarried twice. It broke her, quietly. Thomas played for her on those dark days, using his music as apology and balm. "You don't need to give me more," he once told her gently. "You are enough." By the time Thomas turned 60, he had retired from touring. His fingers, once precise and quick, had slowed. His hearing, once pitch perfect, was beginning to fade. But the house still rang with music, duets in the evening, old recordings spinning as they danced barefoot in the kitchen. He began to write a memoir, calling it Strings Between Us. Then, one quiet morning, Margaret collapsed by the window. A stroke, swift and cruel. She lingered for 2 weeks in a hospital bed, her eyes open but far away. Thomas sat beside her every day, playing soft adagios and lullabies into her ear. The last thing he played was Schubert's Serenade. She died just before dawn. His hand was still on hers. After her funeral, Thomas packed away the violin. He placed it in a cedar box lined with the silk scarf Margaret had worn in Vienna. He carried it to the attic himself, climbing each step as if it might be his last. The attic was dark and smelled of old paper and mothballs. He placed the box in the corner where the sun couldn't reach it. He didn't play again for over a year. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive. The music that once poured from him now swirled inside like a trapped storm. Friends called, but he declined. Students wrote, but he didn't reply. Eventually, with age pressing against his spine and joints like an old debt, he moved into a care home on the outskirts of the city. The walls were white and clean. The staff were kind. The piano in the common room was always slightly out of tune. And he, Thomas Granger, once a name known in concert halls across Europe, was simply another elderly man in a worn cardigan, waiting. Until Lily arrived. Fame, Thomas would later reflect, was like playing a violin on a tightrope, thrilling, delicate, and terrifyingly easy to lose balance. The years between 1962 and 1985 were the height of his career. He played in the Berliner Philharmonie, performed solo at La Scala in Milan, and had standing ovations in Carnegie Hall. Critics called him the Irish firebrand, known for playing with such emotional intensity that audiences left his concerts either weeping or breathless. But no praise moved him more than Margaret's quiet whisper backstage. "You made it feel like love." They traveled the world together. She translated contracts, negotiated logistics, read novels by hotel windows, and carried a tiny notepad where she jotted down her impressions of every city. Sometimes, while he practiced in unfamiliar dressing rooms, she sat cross-legged on the floor, writing poetry. At night, they fell asleep to the lullaby of strange cities, distant sirens, soft jazz, and the clink of glass in faraway bars. Their love was fierce, but not without strain. There were long stretches of separation. Margaret sometimes felt like a satellite to Thomas's orbit, always circling, never still. He tried to slow down, to center her, but the demand for his performances never ceased. One evening, after a tour of Scandinavia, he returned to find her sitting alone on the steps of their home, eyes red from crying. "I don't want to keep meeting you at the edges of our life," she said. "I want to be in the middle of it." He never forgot those words. That winter, he canceled 2 major tours. Critics were baffled, so were agents, but Thomas didn't care. He took Margaret to the west coast of Ireland instead. They rented a cottage near the cliffs of Moher. He wrote music again, not for orchestras, not for critics, but for her. A series of short pieces titled Cliff Songs. Each morning they walked, each evening they listened to the sea crash like timpani against the rocks. The joy of stillness surprised him. It was during this quiet time that Thomas began teaching more consistently. Not just master classes, but ongoing mentorship. He found that sharing music, guiding young fingers through trembling first notes, was almost as rewarding as performing. Almost. There was one student, a prodigious teen named Alice Byrne, who reminded him of himself at 15, obsessed with perfection, tortured by the tiniest mistakes. "Perfection is a thief," he told her one afternoon. "It'll steal your joy if you let it." She never forgot that. Neither did he. But the golden years had shadows too. In his early 60s, Thomas noticed tremors in his hands, barely perceptible, but enough to make him miss a note now and then. At first, he joked about it. "Too much whiskey in my blood," he'd say. But inside, he was terrified. His bow, once so fluid, began to feel like a foreign object, a tool turning against its master. Margaret noticed the shift long before he admitted it. She saw how he hesitated before lifting the instrument, how he practiced longer but played shorter. She never pushed, only watched with that quiet steadiness he had come to lean on. One day, she brought home an old record player and set it beside the piano. "What's this for?" he asked. "So we remember how much you've already given the world," she said, and played one of his earliest recordings. He sat on the couch, eyes closed, hearing the echo of his youth, the boldness, the clarity, the arrogance too. He smiled. "I was bloody good." "You still are," she said softly, but her eyes shimmered with knowing sadness. The diagnosis came soon after. Essential tremor. Not Parkinson's, but enough to make professional performance near impossible. The specialist was kind, clinical, and cautious. "You can still play," he said, "but not as you once did. Time changes the hands." Thomas nodded, but inside, a symphony ended. He played a few more private performances, one last benefit concert for a children's hospital, a final duet with Margaret at a charity ball. But slowly, the violin returned to its case. More often than not, the music that had once roared through his veins now came in whispers, soft and scattered. Still, life with Margaret sustained him. They took up gardening, read to each other by the fire, took short trips across Ireland, revisiting places from their youth. They watched the seasons turn like pages in an old book. Until the morning it all changed. He had been making tea, humming a tune from Ravel, when he heard the sound, something between a sigh and a thud. Margaret had collapsed by the window, sunlight falling across her face, like a spotlight on closing night. The hospital room was cold, sterile. Machines hummed and beeped around her, but she did not speak. He played for her every day, slow, soft pieces, Clair de Lune, Spiegel im Spiegel, and the lullaby he'd written for her after their wedding. Nurses cried in the hallway. On the 12th day, her breathing slowed. Thomas, sitting beside her with the violin on his lap, played Schubert's Serenade. As the final note faded into silence, she exhaled and didn't inhale again. Everything after that was a blur. Condolences, casseroles, the funeral. Friends called, students sent flowers, the conservatory offered a memorial concert in her name. He refused. He couldn't bear to speak her name aloud, let alone watch someone else play music in her memory. Instead, he closed the house, packed away the violin, climbed the attic stairs, and placed the instrument in its box, lined with Margaret's favorite scarf embroidered with lilacs. He descended the stairs alone, leaving the attic door open, as if hoping the music might one day wander back down. The care home was called Brackenhill Lodge, a tidy name, polite and vaguely botanical, like the name of a tea brand or an old estate in an English novel. But to Thomas, it may as well have been called The End. He didn't remember agreeing to move in. His niece, Siobhan, Margaret's goddaughter, had gently insisted. She had visited a few weeks after the funeral, found him unwashed, the kettle burned dry, and his shoes on the wrong feet. "Uncle Tom, you can't be here alone," she had said, kneeling beside him. "A place where they can care for you properly. It doesn't have to mean giving up." He didn't argue. What was the point? So the house was sold, the furniture divided, the attic emptied. He never asked where the violin went, only that Siobhan promised to keep it somewhere safe. He felt as though he had left his life behind in labeled boxes. Brackenhill was clean, well-funded, and cheerful in the way that tried too hard. The walls were covered in pastel art prints and fake ivy. The smell of bleach and overcooked peas hung in the corridors. In the mornings, there was porridge and tea. At noon, fish or chicken with soft vegetables. The staff smiled with trained kindness, always using first names, as though they were old friends. "Morning, Thomas. Did you sleep well, Thomas? Don't forget bingo at 2. He didn't speak much. He didn't play the piano in the common room, even when the other residents encouraged him. His fingers could still find the keys, but his heart wasn't there. Music without Margaret felt like breath without lungs. His room was small and bright, facing a garden that never seemed to change. A bird feeder hung by the window, where sparrows gathered like gossiping neighbors. On the bedside table sat a framed photo of Margaret, the same one he kept in his wallet for over 40 years. She was laughing in the picture, her hand mid-gesture, a cafe in Prague behind her. He talked to her sometimes, not aloud, but in thoughts. You'd hate this place, he would think. Too many schedules, too much beige. At night, the days began to blend together. Monday was the same as Thursday. He took his pills, sat in the garden, watched other residents come and go. Some with family who visited on Sundays, others who faded quietly, their names erased from whiteboards, their rooms cleaned out by morning. He began to wonder if this was what it meant to be old, to vanish in slow motion. He missed sounds more than anything, not just music, but the life in it, the laughter of children, the clink of wine glasses, Margaret's piano playing as she waited for water to boil. There was a woman named Elsie down the hall who told the same story every day about meeting Frank Sinatra, a man named George who used to be a carpenter and now shuffled in circles, looking for tools that no longer existed. They were kind enough, but trapped in their own quiet cages. Thomas, for the most part, kept to himself, until Lily arrived.
It was a Tuesday. He remembered because the tea was slightly colder than usual and the morning paper had arrived late. She breezed into the dining hall with a clipboard and mismatched socks, her hair in a messy bun, earbuds dangling from her pocket. Unlike the others, she didn't wear scrubs, just jeans and a navy cardigan. He noticed she called the residents Sir and Ma'am instead of their first names, which earned her puzzled looks from the staff, but appreciative nods from the old-timers. When she introduced herself to him, she said, "Mr. Granger, I'm Lily. I'm your new afternoon nurse." "Don't worry, I don't ask a lot of questions." He grunted in response. Over the next few days, she appeared at his door like clockwork. Not pushy, just present, checking blood pressure, offering tea, sometimes sitting silently while he read the paper. He appreciated her silence more than anything else. It didn't press, it allowed. But she noticed things. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on the music-themed calendar in the hallway. How his hands still curled slightly, as if cradling a bow. One afternoon, she spotted a folded newspaper clipping inside his copy of the Dublin Review. It was an old concert announcement from 1971. Granger returns to National Concert Hall. She didn't say a word, just noted it. Another day, she brought in a small Bluetooth speaker and softly played Bach's Air on the G string during his afternoon tea. He didn't react at first, but she saw the twitch in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes. She turned it off gently after a few minutes and said nothing. That evening, as she was leaving, he called out for the first time. "That piece," he said. "It's always in D major, but it still surprises you." She smiled. "My dad played it when I was little. He used to say Bach was the heartbeat of the soul." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Your father had good taste." Lily started visiting more often. Sometimes on her breaks, sometimes just to sit and read beside him. She didn't ask about the violin, not yet. But she brought in books on composers, photos of old concert halls, and one afternoon, a biography of Yehudi Menuhin. When she finally asked, "Did you used to play?" he simply said, "I lived." It was the first time in months he had acknowledged the violin aloud. The admission came like a breath held too long, released at last. A week later, she brought in a photo she found online. Thomas Granger in his prime, standing with a full orchestra behind him, bow raised midair, eyes closed. She placed it on his nightstand beside Margaret's picture. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "That was Vienna. I had everything in that moment." "You still do," she said. That night, he dreamed of the Musikverein again. But this time, Margaret wasn't in the crowd. She was beside him on stage, playing the piano. He woke up with tears on his pillow. It was a Wednesday when Lily brought the violin back. Thomas was dozing in his chair, the afternoon sun warming the top of his hands, when he heard the click of the door opening. He didn't bother opening his eyes. It was a Wednesday when Lily brought the violin back. Thomas was dozing in his chair, the afternoon sun warming the top of his hands, when he heard the click of the door opening. He didn't bother opening his eyes. "I'm not due for pills," he muttered. "I know," Lily said, "but you're due for this." Something was set down gently on the table beside him. He opened his eyes. The case was unmistakable. Cedar wood, brass clasps slightly tarnished, the faint scent of lavender still rising from its edges. Margaret's scarf was wrapped around the handle, knotted as she used to do before long train journeys. Thomas stared at it, his throat tight. "Where?" "Your niece had it in her attic," Lily said softly. "I called. She said you might want it back. I told her I wasn't sure, but I'd bring it anyway." He didn't move. The silence between them stretched long. "I don't want to play," he said at last. "I didn't bring it so you'd play," she replied. "I brought it so you'd remember who you still are." Later that evening, when the hallway lights dimmed and the chatter of residents softened behind closed doors, Thomas opened the case. The violin gleamed beneath its velvet lining. It was worn, yes, fingerboard dulled, varnish scratched, but it still carried its soul. Margaret's scarf, tucked inside, held the shape of a life once shared. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to, not yet. Instead, he sat there and let the memories wash over him. A cathedral in Florence, a snowstorm in Krakow, Margaret leaning against a stage curtain, humming along with him as he practiced scales. He closed his eyes and saw her clearly, not as she was in the hospital, but as she was when they first met. Vibrant, full of questions, hands always reaching for something beautiful. The next week, Lily had another idea. "There's a primary school just down the road," she said. "They've got a small music program, but barely any instruments. I was wondering, would you ever consider teaching?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Teaching? At my age?" "You wouldn't have to go anywhere," Lily said. "They could come here. Once a week, just a few of them. We could hold it in the courtyard. You wouldn't even have to play, just talk to them." He scoffed at first. What could I possibly give them? But Lily didn't argue. She simply placed a copy of A Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra on his table and walked away. The idea clung to him for days. He kept imagining a courtyard filled not with wheelchair-bound residents or walkers and hushed staff, but with children, noisy and impatient, full of questions. What would they even ask him? What would they understand about Tchaikovsky, about grief? Then he remembered Alice Byrne, the student from years ago who couldn't tolerate her own mistakes. He remembered her hands shaking during her first recital, and the way he'd placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You're not here to impress. You're here to feel." Maybe that was still worth passing on. He told Lily yes. The first class was chaotic. 4 children came. 2 girls, 2 boys, ages between 8 and 11. They were excited, distracted, fidgeting with their sleeves and shoelaces. Lily handed each of them a plastic folder with blank sheet music. The violins they brought were scratched and out of tune, their bows clumsy, held like soup ladles. Thomas watched them for a while before he spoke. "Do you know why a violin only has 4 strings?" he asked. One boy shrugged. "So it's easier to carry." The others giggled. "No," Thomas smiled. "It's because it doesn't need more. If you play it right, 4 strings are enough to tell the whole story of a person's heart." The courtyard fell quiet, and so once a week he taught. He didn't give them lectures on scales or arpeggios. He told them stories about composers who wrote through heartbreak, about concert halls that smelled of roses, about how the bow should glide like breath, not thunder. He demonstrated posture, breathing, listening. They weren't very good at first, but they were eager. He found himself looking forward to Wednesdays. He shaved. He wore his old brown vest. He cleaned his shoes. He even began walking the courtyard slowly before the children arrived, humming softly to himself. Lily watched from the hallway. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was undeniable. Thomas walked taller. He smiled more. He even corrected the out-of-tune piano in the common room one afternoon, muttering that it was no way to treat Chopin. One student, Daniel, stood out. He was quiet, more serious than the others. While the others laughed and joked, Daniel listened, watched, practiced. When Thomas showed him a simple Irish reel, Daniel stayed behind after the lesson, asking, "Was that in D minor or modal?" Thomas blinked, surprised. Both, in a way. Daniel nodded, then asked, "Can I stay and help you pack up?" After that, Daniel always stayed. One Wednesday, as the days grew colder and the courtyard's roses lost their bloom, Daniel lingered longer than usual. "Mr. Granger," he asked almost shyly, "do you still play?" Thomas hesitated. "Not really." Daniel looked at the old violin case sitting near the bench. "Can I hear it just once?" There was no pressure in the boy's voice. No expectation, only quiet curiosity. Thomas reached for the violin. The first notes were shaky. His fingers hesitated, his bow slipped. But as he moved into the first phrase of The Swan by Saint-Saëns, the tremble in his hand was overtaken by something older and deeper. Muscle memory and the muscle of memory itself. The boy watched, wide-eyed. By the time the final note dissolved into air, Thomas was breathless, exhausted, but alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I wasn't perfect," he said, exhaling. Daniel shook his head. "It was better than perfect." A few weeks later, Lily proposed something bold. "Let's host a concert here," she said. "Just in the courtyard. The kids can play. You can conduct. Maybe even play a piece." Thomas laughed. "I haven't performed in a decade." "You've been performing every Wednesday," she said. "You just forgot to notice." They picked a date, November 10th. Parents were invited. Staff hung lights in the courtyard trees. Residents prepared cookies. A printed program was made. Strings of Memory, An Afternoon with the Children and Mr. Granger. Thomas chose the closing piece himself, Ave Maria. A week before the concert, Daniel approached him. "Mr. Granger," he said, "may I play your violin?" Thomas looked at the boy, then at the case. He nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, you may." The morning of the concert dawned cold and crisp, the kind of late autumn day where breath hangs in the air and everything feels sharpened by the chill. At Brackenhill Loy,
Thomas sat by the window of his room, wearing his best wool coat and a charcoal scarf Margaret had knit during one of his Scandinavian tours. His fingers, though stiff with age, moved steadily as he buttoned the coat. He hadn't dressed for an audience in years. As he smoothed his hair in the mirror, he saw a flash, not of the old man he'd become, but of the young man who once tuned his violin backstage in Paris, heart racing. Lily knocked lightly and peeked in. "They're ready when you are, maestro." He smiled at the word, not mockingly, not wistfully, just grateful. She helped him down the corridor and through the garden doors. Residents, staff, and parents had already gathered. Children giggled in the back rows, fidgeting with their instruments. Daniel stood by the stage, holding the cedar violin case carefully in both hands, like something sacred. The chatter died as Thomas approached the front. People clapped gently, respectfully. Some stood. He took his seat in the first row, folding his hands in his lap. Lily leaned over and whispered, "Want to say a few words?" Thomas thought for a moment. Then he stood. "My name is Thomas Granger," he said. "Once upon a time, I played music in great halls. I thought that was the pinnacle of my life. But I was wrong." He paused, scanning the audience. At the residents, bundled in coats and blankets. At the children, shifting nervously. At Daniel, with his eyes wide and shining. The most important music, he continued, is the kind you give away. And with that, he nodded to the children. They began with Ode to Joy. The intonation was off, timing staggered, but the enthusiasm was pure. The audience clapped with delight. Then came Danny Boy, soft and halting, but heartfelt. A mother in the back wiped tears from her cheeks. Thomas remained quiet, occasionally tapping his foot, nodding along, smiling whenever a child made it through a difficult passage. And then it was Daniel's turn. The boy stepped up to the platform, violin in hand. The old, worn violin Thomas had once played beneath chandeliers and spotlights. He tucked it beneath his chin, closed his eyes, and began Ave Maria. The first note rang out, clear and trembling, as if the violin itself remembered. His bow hand shook slightly, but he adjusted. His fingers moved with care, not speed. He wasn't imitating brilliance, he was channeling reverence. As the melody unfolded, Thomas closed his eyes. And in the darkness, the memories came. Margaret in her nightgown, brushing her hair. The cold stage in Berlin, his fingers numb but flying. Lily's voice, soft and insistent. You still are. The children's laughter, like music notes spilling across the garden. The first time he held the violin, the last time he played it. The ache of silence. He remained seated, eyes closed, his face wet with tears. He didn't need to stand. He was already full, already lifted. Thomas passed away 2 weeks later, in his sleep, peacefully. There were no dramatic signs, no final words. A nurse found him in the morning, hands folded neatly over his chest, a faint smile on his lips. The photo of Margaret was on his nightstand, alongside the violin case, still open, scarf draped like a blessing. The care home held a small memorial. Daniel played the swan. Lily gave a short speech. At the funeral, Daniel placed the violin on the altar. A simple white card was tied to the bow with twine. It read, "You gave me music. I'll carry it forward." A year had passed since Thomas Granger's death. Brackenhill Lodge had changed in small, quiet ways. The courtyard now held a new bench with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Granger. He taught us that silence is never the end." Beside it, the care home planted a small lilac tree, Margaret's favorite flower. Every Wednesday, the music still returned. Lily had kept the tradition alive, arranging for Daniel and other students to continue visiting. The children now came in pairs or trios, playing short pieces for the residents, sometimes reciting poems or reading aloud from Thomas's old books. The care home was livelier, more alert. Even Elsie, who still told stories about Frank Sinatra, now asked the kids if they knew any swing. Daniel had grown taller, his shoulders squarer. His playing had matured too, more fluid, more confident. He was accepted into a junior music conservatory in Dublin, and during his audition, he played Ave Maria on Thomas's violin. The judges were silent when he finished. One of them finally said, "Who taught you to play like that?" Daniel simply said, "A man who played with his heart." Lily kept in touch with Siobhan, Thomas's niece, and made sure the violin was protected. It remained with Daniel, by Thomas's own request in his will, passed on, not for fame or fortune, but because music is a light that must be carried. On the anniversary of his passing, Lily returned to Brackenhill alone. It was a quiet morning. Frost kissed the edges of the bench. The lilac tree had grown a little, its branches thin but strong. She sat down and took out a small notebook. Inside were notes from her time with Thomas, quotes, fragments of conversations, the photo she had first found of him standing beside an orchestra. She flipped to the final page, where she'd written something after his funeral, a kind of letter she never had the courage to read aloud. You didn't just teach the children. That silence is sacred, not empty. That grief is not the end of love. That what we pass on is sometimes invisible, but never forgotten. You gave the world more